Now let's look at the client object model in a Windows Presentation Foundation application. So we have a text box and an expander on our WPF form, and we'll work with the text box to instantiate a new context for our client object. And we will also populate the list box underneath the expander with the lists from the web that we've retrieved. The first thing I did was add references to Microsoft.SharePoint.client DLLs, and those were in the ISAPI folder as we discussed in the previous video. Now we have this expander and a list box, and we have an event hooked up for us already, but we will add the client object model code now. The first thing we'll do is to instantiate and create a client context object, and we'll call it CTX. And in its constructor we will provide the URL that the user types into the text box on the WPF form. We can then instantiate and declare a web object variable, and the web variable, or at least the web object, is very similar to SPWeb that you may have used on the server, but on the client it's called web. So we instantiate that and set it equal to the web property of the client context. We then call load to ensure that the web object is available to our code, and we will also load the lists collection of the web object. So this will allow us at some point to retrieve a list of lists, if you will. Now the lists that we want to retrieve are actually those that have a title, because we're going to use those titles in our list box. And so we can use a lambda expression to specify that the client object model should only retrieve lists where the title of the list is not null. So in our lambda expression we'll use a where clause, and the where clause very simply just says where the list.title is not equal to null. So there we have our lambda expression hooked up into the load method call of the client context object. What we must now do is call execute query. Because we're running from a .NET application, we can call execute query directly, and this takes the commands that we've previously written, it batches them and sends them to the SharePoint server for execution. So we clear our list items from our list box, which is underneath the expander object, and we'll clear the current values there and then iterate through the list objects in the lists collection of the web. So this collection has already been prepared, and by the time we call execute query we know that it's fully populated. So we can now start working with those lists. Now I fully qualify my LST variable as a Microsoft.SharePoint.client.list, and that's purely because list is an ambiguous class. We have a list class in the systems.collections namespace, for example, and that's not really the type that we want. And list also exists in some UI components, so we'll fully qualify it to make sure we're working with a SharePoint list. But once we've done that, we have our own LST variable that's a SharePoint list, and we are iterating through the lists collection and adding the lists title to our list box. We call dispose for the context object to ensure that all references to underlying objects are disposed of, and we will catch any exceptions, and if any occur we'll provide the error message for the exceptions in the list box as well. For example, a user may have typed in a non-existent or non-contactable SharePoint URL in the site URL text box. So there we have it. We have a way of contacting SharePoint from a Windows Presentation Foundation application. We've loaded lists and webs, and in fact we've provided a modified view of lists and populated a list box when we click the expander drop down. So I'll type in the URL to a SharePoint site that I know exists, and when I click show lists, our client context object will retrieve those for us, and our code populates our list box, and that's beneath this expander. So let's see if I type in a non-existent SharePoint URL and click show lists. Well, this causes an exception, and so we add that exception message to our list box.